In the cold, freezing skies over Germany in the spring of 1944, American bomber crews realized a terrifying truth about their mission. They were told they were flying into the heart of the Third Reich to destroy factories, shatter rail yards, and cripple the German war economy. But as they flew deeper into enemy territory, surrounded by the screaming engines of the Luftwaffe's deadliest fighter planes, a much darker reality set in. The Allied High Command didn't just expect them to be attacked, they wanted them to be attacked. In a brutal, cold-blooded calculation that changed the course of the Second World War, the thousands of young men flying inside the heavy bombers were not just the weapon, they were the bait. They were participating in a massive, deadly psychological trap designed to force the German Air Force into a battle of absolute annihilation. By the end of the campaign, fewer than a quarter of the British and American bomber crews would survive. It was an apocalyptic meat grinder in the sky. But why would the Allied commanders intentionally use their own men as bait? Why sacrifice thousands of expensive heavy bombers in a war of attrition? To understand the brutal mathematics of this trap, you have to look at the massive system flaw in Adolf Hitler's European empire and the impossible engineering glitch that finally allowed the Allies to exploit it. By 1942, the Third Reich had conquered nearly the entire European continent. From the English Channel to the plains of Russia, Hitler controlled everything. Anticipating an Allied invasion, he ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall, a sprawling, multi-billion-dollar labyrinth of concrete bunkers, artillery batteries, and landmines designed to make Europe an impregnable fortress. But as military strategists pointed out at the time, Hitler had built an impenetrable fortress, but he forgot to put a roof over it. The Allies knew that a cross-channel amphibious invasion, Operation Overlord, what we now know as D-Day, was entirely impossible if the Germans controlled the sky. If the Luftwaffe was allowed to patrol the beaches of Normandy, they would annihilate the Allied landing craft before a single boot touched the sand. The mandate was absolute. The Luftwaffe had to be completely eradicated before the spring of 1944. This requirement gave birth to a radical, unproven theory of warfare championed by a group of officers known as the Bomber Barons. They believed in strategic bombing. Instead of fighting armies in the mud, they would fly over them and destroy the factories that produced the enemy's weapons. There was only one problem. The theory was getting the bomber crews slaughtered. In order to bomb German factories, the heavy bombers had to fly deep into hostile territory. But they were slow, lumbering beasts. They desperately needed fighter escorts to protect them from the highly agile German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. Aviation engineers in the early 1940s stated that building a fighter plane capable of escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back was a physical impossibility. To fly 1,000 miles, a fighter would need to carry a massive amount of heavy fuel, which would completely destroy its aerodynamics and make it useless in a fast-paced dogfight. Because the fighters couldn't make the trip, they had to turn around at the German border. The bombers were left completely exposed. The Luftwaffe would simply wait for the Allied fighters to leave and then pounce on the undefended bombers, ripping them out of the sky by the dozens. The Allies needed a mechanical miracle. What they got was a system hack. The Americans were producing a new fighter aircraft for the British called the P-51 Mustang. It was a sleek, aerodynamic plane, but its original engine was severely underpowered at high altitudes. The British test pilots flew it and essentially said, "Thanks, it's okay below 15,000 feet, but it's not what we need." Then, a rogue engineer had a brilliant idea. What if we take the American airframe and bolt a British Rolls-Royce Merlin V12 engine inside it? The marriage of the American chassis and the British engine created a monster. Suddenly, the impossible was real. Equipped with external drop tanks, the new P-51 Mustang could fly all the way to downtown Berlin, drop its empty tanks, and outturn, outclimb, and outgun the best fighters the Luftwaffe had to offer. It was the ultimate weapon of the Anglo-American coalition, and it allowed the Allies to spring the most devastating trap of the air war. In early 1944, knowing the D-Day deadline was rapidly approaching, the Allied air forces launched Operation Argument, a furious, 5-day aerial assault that would become known to history simply as Big Week. This was the moment the strategy fundamentally shifted. The plan was brutal. Send thousands of heavy bombers directly toward the most vital aircraft manufacturing cities in Germany. The Luftwaffe would have absolutely no choice but to launch every single fighter plane they had to defend the homeland. But this time, the bombers were not alone. The P-51 Mustangs were waiting. The American fighter pilots were given new, highly aggressive orders. Their primary mission was no longer just to fly in tight formation and shield the bombers. They were ordered to actively hunt. When the German fighters rose to take the bait, the Mustangs were to break formation, chase the Luftwaffe down, and destroy them in any way, shape, or form. It was a battle of pure, cold-blooded attrition. The skies over Europe turned into a massive, multi-level meat grinder. The losses were catastrophic. During Big Week, the United States lost roughly a quarter of the entire 8th Air Force. Hundreds of bombers fell from the sky, taking thousands of young men with them. But the Allied commanders knew a dark, arithmetic truth. The United States possessed a massive, untouchable war economy, operating thousands of miles away. America was churning out hundreds of heavy bombers every single day, and young men were signing up in droves. No matter how heavy the losses were, the Allies could replace them. Germany could not. In that single, ferocious operation, the Luftwaffe lost roughly 1/3 of its entire fighter force and 18% of its fighter pilots. It was a fatal blow. A deadly symbiosis had been achieved. The Mustangs slaughtered the German fighter pilots, which cleared the skies for the bombers. The bombers then destroyed the German factories, ensuring no new planes could be built to replace the ones the Mustangs had just shot down. It was a vicious, unbreakable cycle of destruction. In the month following Big Week, American fighters shot down more German planes over Europe than they had in the entire previous 2 years combined. The back of the Luftwaffe was broken forever. When June 6, 1944 finally arrived, the Allied Armada crossed the English Channel to invade Normandy. As the soldiers stormed the beaches, they looked up at the sky in terror, waiting for the devastating dive bombers of the Luftwaffe to wipe them out. But the sky was empty. Command of the air had been decisively, completely established. The brutal strategy had worked perfectly, but the cost was unfathomable. The young men inside the B-17 and Lancasters had essentially been guinea pigs, testing out an unproven, cutting-edge theory of warfare with their lives. Whenever a military experiments with novel technology and high-stakes strategy, the only way to learn if the theory works is by bleeding for it. When the British and American Air Forces united, merging their engineering, their courage, and their ruthless strategic vision, they proved to be the most terrifyingly effective aerial instrument of war in human history. They won the sky, but the thousands of bomber crews who acted as the bait paid for that sky with their lives.